If you've been following this build for pretty much any amount of time, you know that we've been waiting on wheels for months. And we need those wheels in order to finish the suspension design on the car so we can put it back down on the ground. But since we're not able to do that, I've been focusing on the other major milestone, and that's getting the Honda-swapped Ferrari running for the first time. Now in the last episode, we went through a pretty condensed checklist and confirmed we are indeed really close to being able to do that. We're very close to a first start. But there are a few major hurdles left, and I want to try to get those out of the way. So today, we're going to pull the engine and transmission out of the car so we can install our clutch and flywheel, install a starter, and attach some brackets to the chassis that we need in order to finish the cooling system for the car. So let's dive into it and see how far we get today. But before we go ripping the engine out of the Ferrari, there was progress made elsewhere over the weekend. My buddy Dan came over to the shop and laid down some beautiful aluminum beads to get our intake piping welded up and to the finish line. This thing looks a lot better than I'd be capable of doing on my own, and it's going to look great sitting front and center in the engine bay. Dan also put in some work finishing out the water end tanks on our water-to-air intercooler. There was a lot of welding to do, and it took him quite a bit of time, but once he was finished, we're left with a beautiful, one-of-a-kind water-to-air intercooler, and I think it should look right at home next to all the other crazy and fancy parts in the bay of the Ferrari. There is still one final step needed to finish this up, though. We've got to get the AN bungs welded to each end, a -16 fitting that'll allow us to connect our AN lines and fill this thing with water. And we'll knock that out as soon as we get a second fitting. I installed all of the parts back into the car to check for fitment, and everything is looking really good. The only other thing that we need to solve is a mount for the intercooler itself. And a lot of you guys have been expressing a lot of concern about whether or not the fitting will fit underneath that blow-off valve. And I'm happy to say, although it's close, it does clear. It's not that close, it's probably a ½ inch or so. So we got room, everything works. Obviously the back clears. We just gotta weld these guys on and we're set. But as good as it all looks in there, it's time to pull it right back out, starting with the intake system we just installed. But these vibrant HD clamps make that super easy. There's no tools required, and everything comes out with the pull of a pin. I've shown you guys these before, but this is finally my first chance to show them in action on the car. In less than a minute, I can have all of the intake piping and the intercooler out, which gives us access to everything else. So, piece by piece, I began removing everything that we've been adding to the Ferrari for months. I started with the exhaust and the turbo, and moved my way to the intake and then eventually the wiring. There were a few other hoses and bits and pieces to remove, and then I decided to pull the oil tank and filter housing to give ourselves as much clearance as possible. Even though it's smaller overall than the V8 that came out, it's a lot wider, and so it takes every inch we can get in order to remove it. Seeing everything out of the way, though, is pretty refreshing. It's been a long time since we've gotten to see the engine this stripped down, or see things in the engine bay like the fuel cell that we installed several months ago, or all of the changes that we made to the back side of the engine, because this stuff's been covered up pretty much the entire time. At this point, there's nothing to remove but the engine itself, and of course the transmission attached to it. So I spent a little bit of time getting the gantry all rigged up to the engine, and began pulling this thing out. It's admittedly a pretty simple process, but there is a lot of caution involved. That curved piece of glass at the back of the Ferrari is really close to the oil pump and the alternator as the engine comes up and out of the engine bay, and that's one thing I really don't want to try to replace. Thanks to the car being on a dolly, it's honestly easier just to move the car out of the way instead of the engine, where I can set it down on some blocks of wood to protect the forged oil pan. Now before we dive into the actual clutch and flywheel installation, let's talk a little bit about that totally empty engine bay, because at this point, there's a lot to discuss. Being only about a ½ mile from the ocean means the salty air in the shop makes all the bare steel in the Ferrari rust rather quickly. You guys have been asking episode after episode what my plan is for actually finishing this bay out. And worry not, at some point I do plan on going through and painting the entire thing. I found a guy that's willing to come to the shop and do a dustless sandblasting process so that we can get all of the material cleaned up and ready for paint. But that's low on the list of priorities right now. Instead, I want to focus on getting the car running. Back over at the engine, I realized I need to get the engine a bit higher off of the ground. I need the bell housing to clear the concrete so that we can remove the transmission, and that means getting some blocks of wood under the oil pan with enough clearance. Now, if there was any question about why I'd put a Honda motor in the Ferrari, me picking this thing up with one hand is a perfect example of why. That's just not going to happen with a V8. With the transmission removed and out of the way, let's take a quick look once again at the clutch and flywheel package that's going to go in the Ferrari. This Clutchmaster's 725 7¼ inch twin disc setup is a bit of a prototype unit, but it should handle all the power that we want to throw at it and be incredibly drivable on the street. That is, at least ignoring the fact that this is a sequential gearbox and won't be street friendly. This kit's also paired with a lightweight flywheel, which will give us nice snappy revving, and it included a hydraulic throwout bearing, the hydraulic lines, and the necessary alignment tool. But there is one thing it doesn't include. So we've got our parts and we've got our torque specs and we're ready to put it all together, except for the fact that I don't have any flywheel bolts. I completely forgot to order some. The kit didn't come with any. I don't have any on the engine. I feel so stupid getting ready to put this thing together on camera and realizing I cannot. So this is cut quite short. I don't know what we're gonna do now. We're sitting and waiting. So I guess let's take a look in the engine bay and talk about some of the brackets that I've got to make and where we're going to locate some components. I don't know. Now, aside from dealing with all of the rust and finish welding all the stuff in here that needs to get welded, we've got to make some mounts. And the main one is for this water pump. This is the main engine water pump, and it needs to sit up so that the inlet right here is above the chassis height. A big A-end fitting needs to fit and clear. And this hose is going to turn and go directly into the end of it. So it's got to sit pretty much exactly at this position. We'll make sure it clears the fuel tank ever so slightly, but that's the goal. So we're going to fabricate that this weekend. And then we have a bracket made that sits right here for the water pump for the intercooler system, but we borrowed the pump itself for the Model A to get it done. So I've got to order another one of those. Otherwise, there's a couple small projects. I need to finalize the install on our fuel cell mounts, just basically bolt these through the bulkhead. And I want to see if we can get the battery box installed without the engine in place, because we've got a lot more room. So we need to get those parts ordered up from Send Cut Send and get it fabricated. I really do forget how huge the engine bay of this car is once there's not an engine in it. I mean, it's surprising how big a tiny four-cylinder is once you add an intake manifold and a big turbo manifold and a water-to-air intercooler and a dry sump oil system into the engine bay, because it really fills this thing up. But me and several other friends, I'm sure, could hang out in here. It's absolutely massive. Now, I'm going to save most of the welding and the finish work back here, as said, for another time. That's for later down the project. I want to focus on getting this thing running, and I could probably spend a couple of weeks back here on the finish work. I mean, in the end of this project, I do want the engine bay to look good. That's very important to me, and it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a big challenge. It's going to take a lot of hours, but that's not for right now. I'm not going to focus on that. I want to get what's necessary done and get that engine back in this engine bay. So to be honest with you, that feels like probably the least progress I've ever made in an episode. I mean, I know that it's not. Pulling the entire driveline out of it counts for something, but I had higher hopes for this one. It kind of sucks, but it means I've got a lot of things I can focus on over the weekend. I'm gonna get a lot of those brackets in the back made, get a lot of stuff installed, get the clutch and flywheel in the motor. Who knows, maybe even get the engine back in. I don't wanna be too ambitious. There's a lot of stuff going on this weekend, but that's the goal. Just gotta keep focused and keep the pedal down. Keep trying to get closer and closer to having this car running. That's what I want. That's what I'm driven to achieve at the moment. But with that said, this episode's a wrap. I hope you guys enjoyed it as always. I really appreciate your support. Thank you guys for keep coming back and watching this series. I know it drags on sometimes. That's just how builds go. But we're working on it. We're getting it done. We're just going to keep the pedal down. And I'll catch you guys on Tuesday. See you then.